Welcome, everyone. I am delighted to welcome Alex Berenson today back to the program. You can follow Alex, alexberenson.com, Berenson. Also on Twitter at Alex, or on X at Alex Berenson, and Alex Berenson, I think it is .substack.com. It's called Unreported Truths. He was a source of clarity of thought during the hysteria of COVID. Actually wrote a book called Pandemia: How Coronavirus Hysteria Took Over Our Government, Rights, and Lives. There it is. And that looks more prescient than ever. We're going to get into it with him. We were also out on the Twitter Spaces. And of course, as always, I'm watching you guys on the Rumble Rants and the retweets. Let's get right to it.
Our laws, as it pertains to substances, are draconian and bizarre. The psychopaths start this way.
He was an alcoholic.
Because of social media and pornography, PTSD, love addiction, fentanyl and heroin, ridiculous. I'm a doctor, for sake. Where the hell do you think I learned that? I'm just saying, you go to treatment before you kill people. I am a clinician. I observe things about these chemicals. Let's just deal with what's real. We used to get these calls on Loveline all the time. Educate adolescents and to prevent and to treat. If you have trouble you can't stop and you want to help stop it, I can help. I got a lot to say. I got a lot more to say.
Valentine's Day is around the corner, so it is time to look your absolute best. Our friends at GenuCell are celebrating Valentine's Day with a special gift just for you. From now until Valentine's Day, get a limited time gift of beauty box free with your order at GenuCell.com/Drew. Each beauty box has 2 of GenuCell's top sellers for you to give a try. It's absolutely free. And right now, save over 60% off all of our favorite GenuCell products with one of our customized skincare packages.
I know I'm a snob about the products I use on my face. Everybody knows it. Every time I go to the dermatologist's office, they're just rows and rows of different creams. Retinols, vitamin C cream, under eye cream, night creams.
Scrubs.
And then when I get to the counter, they're overpriced. All kinds of products that you can all find at GenuCell.com.
Plus, with its immediate effects, GenuCell promises results that will make you smile. It's guaranteed or 100% of your money back. To let yourself and a loved one with our limited edition bundles right now at GenuCell.com/Drew. Use our special code Drew at checkout for extra savings off your order today. And remember, every order placed is automatically upgraded to free shipping. Don't wait. That is GenuCell.com/Drew, GenuCell.com/DREW. We all know the value of a good night's sleep. We feel better, look better, have more energy to spare, but you could be missing out on all of those benefits if you're sleeping on sheets that are too hot or too cold or just plain uncomfortable. I have the solution. Cozy Earth bedding. Cozy Earth is the softest and most comfortable sheets, blankets, loungewear, and more. They use premium viscose from highly sustainable bamboo, and we sleep in them regularly. I wear their t-shirts. Susan wears their pajamas. Cozy Earth bedding comes with a 100-night sleep trial, which means you have up to 100 nights to sleep on them, wash them, try them out. If you're not in love, just return them within 100 days for a full refund. Susan and I love them. In fact, we have Cozy Earth sheets on our bed right now, and they made a huge difference in our sleep. If you've never tried Cozy Earth, we have some awesome news. You can save up to 35% off Cozy Earth right now. But hurry, this offer will not last. Go to CozyEarth.com, enter my promo code Drew at checkout for up to 35% off on your first order. That is CozyEarth.com, promo code Drew, CozyEarth, CozyEarth.com, code DREW. Thank you for joining us today. Alex Berenson, the guest. I'll give you the particulars again on X, Alex Berenson, alexberenson.com, and then alexberenson.substack.com, Unreported Truths and Pandemia. There is the book. Please do get it and read it. Welcome, Alex Berenson. I was just thinking before I got you in here, Alex, that you were a source of solace and sanity for me during the pandemic. So thank you for that.
Thank you for having me on, really. I know we've talked a few times, but it's always a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much. And I've got a lot of stuff I want to ask you today, but before the mics heated up, you mentioned that you were writing about Pfizer, and I thought maybe I'll start with that Super Bowl ad. Is the $14 million they spent on the ad, is that for the totality of the production and the time, or is that just one or the other?
That is just so, the Super Bowl, $7 million for a 30-second ad. You don't get a discount for buying 2. So there's $14 million for the time. they've licensed the Queen song. They spent another $1 million or $2 million probably producing it. I've actually written 2 Substacks about this because I found it so fascinating, their effort to sort of tie themselves. Essentially, you remember in 2021, Anthony Fauci was brutally and correctly attacked for saying essentially, "I am science." What he actually said when I look back was he said, "I represent science, and that's why they're attacking me." And that ad was Pfizer saying, "We're science, 175 years. Look at all the sciencey science that we've done." And the irony, the great sad irony, is that Pfizer is actually a really third-rate drug company. For their size and for the number of scientists they have, for their revenues, they've produced very little in the way of important drugs, over the life of that company. And I say that as somebody. This was first obvious to me. This is what I wrote about in the first stack. Compared to Merck, for example, which is another big drug company. Merck introduced the first statin. Merck has a very, very, very successful cancer drug, an important cancer drug called Keytruda now. Pfizer's really never had a drug like that. Pfizer's most important drug, you would argue that, they had a drug called Lipitor, but Lipitor was just another statin that they were very good at marketing. Their most important drug, arguably, was Viagra. And look, Viagra, as I joke in the piece today, in the Unreported Truths today, Viagra has probably saved some marriages. It's probably also destroyed some marriages. But Viagra does, it's not a cancer drug. So when Pfizer tries to take on this mantle of, we are the scientific leader, we're the heirs to Einstein, it's just a joke. It's just sort of a wish fulfillment.
They had Vioxx, did they not? Wasn't Vioxx their product?
No, that was Merck. Ironically,
is that Merck? Okay.
Pfizer had a drug called Celebrex, and Celebrex wasn't as toxic as Vioxx because it wasn't as good as Vioxx. It wasn't as COX-1 selective as Vioxx. So it didn't work as well. I should say COX-2. It wasn't as good a COX-2 inhibitor. COX-2. And so Merck got in more trouble.
Yeah. In fact, I was telling somebody, I was telling Mark Geragos, I was talking about, because he, I guess, was in on that case. And I said 2 things. I said, A, I have patients that have never been the same since they took that medicine off the market. For some of my arthritis patients, it was sensational. And then I said, wasn't it the case that it only killed like about 8 people? That we could connect it to? And why are we not making a fuss about the deaths now and what it's products that might be causing death? Why don't we have the same level of concern for more than 8 deaths?
So I will say that's actually a very interesting question. The estimates were that Vioxx had caused, I believe, it was 150,000 heart attacks and 40,000 fatalities.
And that was a construct. Hang on, that was a construct for the case. Yes. That's the law. There were 8 documented cases, as I recall.
You are absolutely
and I was a big Vioxx prescriber, and it's not like we saw lots of heart attacks, right? We didn't see anything. I didn't see, and what I have seen recently is a lot of myocarditis and a lot of arrhythmias and things and some very strange coronary disease that has me very concerned.
So you are absolutely correct about that, Dr. Drew. That was an estimate, and this is actually very relevant to the vaccine question, right? So heart attacks are very common in the United States. Vioxx was very heavily prescribed. People made a guess based on, there was a trial where Merck tested Vioxx against placebo because they wanted it to be approved for colon cancer prevention. The trial was actually called APPROVE, and that gave clean data against placebo showing that Vioxx caused heart attacks. And that's what led Vioxx to be pulled from the market. But you are correct that when the lawyers showed up, and Merck ultimately, I think, funded a settlement to the tune of about $5 billion, there weren't as many people who could prove that they had heart attacks caused by Vioxx as had initially been estimated based on that trial. And I think what that tells you is in the real world, it is so hard when you have a common event and you have a drug or a vaccine that's commonly given to parse out what's happening. And we have that even more with the vaccines. And the vaccines don't have a clean placebo-controlled trial because the trials from 2020 were all blown up in early 2021. And that is, to some extent, that is working to Pfizer's advantage. It is working to Moderna's advantage. It is working to the government's advantage because we're all fighting with dirty data.
On top of that, I'm of the opinion that the pathogenic component of all of this is the spike protein itself. And now you've got COVID and the vaccine intertwined, and it's very hard to parse these things out. And thank you for bringing back to the tune of. I think we ought to use that phrase more often, to the tune of. And finally, like we're both some kind of time traveler that we use that phrase. But finally, what Geragos was telling me, because this is the part I find interesting, and I think you'll find interesting, which is that I said, when they apparently had some data where they observed some heart attacks, and I said, well, how did they decide that the heart attacks were not related to the Vioxx? And their response was, well, they had a guy that went in and looked at it. And guess what we're doing now with the VAERS data and the research on vaccine? The FDA has a guy, and he goes in and tries to do something that can't be done. And we have a case that was exemplary to that end. And so what are we supposed to be doing here? And what is wrong with the FDA?
Well, I mean, it's right. It's in a way, it's even uglier than that, right? The companies run the clinical trials, right? And they select the investigators, or they hire the contract research organizations. And look, I think there are very good, very honest scientists in there. There can also be scientists who either don't want to fight with the companies, they're just not sort of inclined to fight with them, or in some cases it might be a little worse than that, where they really, they want more jobs going forward, and they know if they fight too much with the companies, they may not get more research jobs going forward. And so let's say somebody has an event in the trial, and you break the blind, and it turns out that person was on the drug or on the vaccine. Well, the company and the investigator determine whether they believe that was related or not. And so sometimes the companies put pressure on the investigators to say, you know what, it was 3 weeks later, it was a heart attack, but yeah, the person had, they had high cholesterol before. I don't think it was related. And so even, and I do think that generally our system of clinical research is pretty good, but if you're not honest, there are places to play games.
Well, I would just say this. My profession was the object of all kinds of scrutiny or let's not call it scrutiny, manipulation by the drug companies. And even very, very mild contact with a drug rep has been shown to cause bias in how we prescribe, to the point now we are not allowed to accept a pen with a drug name on it. How is it not the case that somebody who is doing research with a coworker who will one day hire them, how is that not creating bias? And yet a freaking pen is supposed to bias me, a professional who's trained not to be biased, by the way. Tell me how that works.
I think you're correct. You just have to look. Someone has to pay for drug research and discovery, and the companies do it. They are correct. Creating a drug, bringing it to market takes a very long time. From the very first, you've the first receptor you find, the first molecule you discover. Now with these monoclonal antibodies and big molecules, biologics, it's even harder. Someone has to pay for that, and it's not the FDA or the CDC that pays for it, it's the companies that pay for it. And so I think we just have to hope that there are ethical people in there. To me, I think in general, at early stages, the companies are willing to see that there are problems and stop discovery. The problem comes late in the game, when you have a drug that is close to being marketed or that is on the market where they've put substantial resources in. At that point, they're going to, and by substantial resources, I mean hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars in some cases, they're going to do what they can to protect those drugs. And usually they have a story to tell for Vioxx, just to go back to that, because that's a case you and I both know. The story was there are people who have stomach problems, who can't tolerate aspirin or ibuprofen, and this drug enables them to live with less pain and not have ulcers. And that's a good thing. And yes, we saw some extra heart attacks in our clinical trials, but that's because naproxen is so good at preventing heart attacks. That was always Merck's position on this. Okay. And it's very interesting. This is 20 years later, Dr. Drew, and you are out there essentially arguing that Vioxx shouldn't have been pulled. Okay. So these questions get complicated. I think in the case of the vaccines, it's really problematic. And here's why. Okay. We do have some institutional checks and balances on drugs, right? We have trial lawyers out there who are looking for drugs that cause problems and are willing to sue about them. And, that costs Merck money. We have an FDA that sometimes will push back or at least cause the disclosure of more data. We have a media that asks questions. Well, guess what? I mean, when I worked at the New York Times, none of those things when it comes to vaccines in particular. There is there's no liability. The FDA, the head vaccine regulator at the FDA was literally, no joke, no exaggeration, Dr. Peter Marks, the guy who came up with Operation Warp Speed. And the media was entirely in the tank for these vaccines, both because they hated Trump once Biden was elected and the vaccines were available, they wanted COVID to end, and because the word vaccine has this sort of magic power over everyone. And so all the sources of checks were not there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am quite aware. In fact, it's interesting. I don't know if you know Joseph Fryman, but he's done some great research and some great work. And he did an interview with the FDA with his research team. If you look at one of my older episodes with him, he actually played us some of the tape. And Marks is in there, and a rheumatologist, pediatric rheumatologist from out here at UCLA said, look, I sent a VAERS report in a month ago or something. I had a 7-year-old that died the next day within 24 hours of the vaccine. I've not heard from the FDA. There's the actual interview. And
this man's saying you did.
Here it is.
Follow up on pediatric death. If they're surveillance,
I filed a VAERS, and I'm a UCLA pediatric specialist. This is just an N of one, but February 25th, I filed a VAERS report on a 7-year-old patient who had a cardiac arrest following his first Pfizer vaccination. It was about 30 hours after he got the vaccine. I didn't receive any follow-up about it. The patient died about 8 days later. I submitted another email offering to update the report with the death of the patient. It's been 2 weeks now. I still haven't heard anything. So I'm wondering if there's
keep going. No, keep going.
More extensive surveillance than just VAERS-based surveillance for cases like this.
You got to hear his response.
I would think that if the death of a 7-year-old following the vaccine is not, meriting follow-up, either the system is totally overwhelmed or there's something wrong with the reporting system.
I want to play you some of the responses to this, and then you can email us about something.
Well,
details of each of them in many cases be followed up within. Does that?
And then you can email us.
But does that sound right, Steve? Yeah, so they should be followed up within a matter of days, actually. So just drop me an email. Or Rich, and then we'll just send it to our surveillance group.
That's our surveillance
to make sure that it didn't. I got it.
Anyway, he goes on to say, maybe something fell through the cracks. And Berenson goes, yes, something fell through the cracks. And you should be shitting yourself because of it. You should be falling on your sword. You should be mortified that could happen even. Instead, it's like, we'll get around to it. They usually get around quicker. And just send me an email and we'll get to it. It's insane.
No, it's a 7-year-old kid goes into cardiac arrest. I mean, that you should have a team on the ground within 24 hours, right? Look, there's no question the vaccines are the mRNAs, that is, they're cardiotoxic to some people. They cause autoimmune responses in some people. I think we're going to be arguing for a long time about how many people that is and the mechanism of action. I think, you make a case that it's the spike, sort of overproduction of the spike. I think there's a legitimate argument out there that it maybe is a lipid nanoparticle, that may have something to do with it also, that they really don't know exactly what the perturbations that may cause in people, especially with repeated injection.
I'm aware. We cover this stuff a lot here, but I'm telling you, the more I zero in on it, the more the spike protein looks like the culprit, which is why one of the questions I have is, there are whole virus vaccines out there like Covaxin. Why aren't we doing other vaccines except for the ones that creates the pathogenic protein? Why don't we offer something else? If the vaccine is so important, which again, I don't understand that for an illness that has A, no risk to young people, B, good treatments. We have Paxlovid, we have monoclonal, we have all kinds of stuff. And what are we doing? Why are we doing that? And let me just add one little wrinkle on this. I'm so conflicted. You said earlier about the cost of phase 3 trials and whatnot. And look, as an internist, guess what we do? We try to increase longevity and treat medical illnesses with medicine. That's what we do. And we rely on the drug companies. And they're mostly been an incredibly good partner in all this. And it's very, and I wonder if there's a difference between the US and the European companies, but that's something you can address. But it's very hurtful to me. It kills me to have to take aim at them because we need them and we need their money for the phase 3 trials, and we've been great partners all these years, and now what's going on? It feels to me like the government has adulterated so much of this. That's what it feels like to me.
I mean, honestly, I think the companies are what they've always been. Look back 30 years, right, when they were able not just to hand out pens, but they would take you guys to, they take you to Aspen for a week, right? And basically, there was semi-open bribery for prescriptions. That's kind of been pushed aside now. So no, I don't think the companies are better or worse than they've been. I mean, Purdue Pharma, that company came around in the 1990s, it was when it really started. Thalidomide, that drug is 60 years old. The companies have always been problematic actors. The difference, again, specifically with the vaccines, is that all the other safeguards are gone. Right. And here it's very interesting. You mentioned the potential of Covaxin or whole virus vaccines. It's clear that the U.S. government wanted the mRNAs. Okay, there was the NIH was in literal business with Moderna, okay? And Pfizer's a U.S. company, and there was this idea sort of they were the national champions. AstraZeneca, which had a DNA vaccine, that's an English company. Of course, all the other vaccines, really the inactivated virus vaccines, those were Chinese and Indian. The Russians had their own vaccine, but the mRNAs were really American vaccines, even though BioNTech was a German company. And there was an idea that they were going to be our national champions. Now, one thing drug companies don't like to do, they'll do it on occasion, but they don't like to do is they don't like to run head-to-head trials, right? Where you compare one drug against another drug to see which one.
I've noticed.
You noticed that, right? The U.S. actually, when it came to COVID, had a unique opportunity essentially to force the companies into one big trial. Because what they could have said was, we're not going to pay for any vaccine that isn't tested in, let's say, a 6-way clinical trial that would include the Johnson & Johnson, that might include Novavax, that might include, an inactivated virus vaccine. Let's do this. Let's get a head-to-head trial. We didn't do that. And I think the reason was primarily speed, but it was also that the U.S. really wanted the mRNA vaccines. And I don't know if you remember, you probably remember, you may not have, you probably do remember, there was this idea, we're going to swap it. It's software. mRNA is the software of life. We're going to be able to swap out whenever there's a new variant. We'll be able to introduce a new vaccine within weeks. And this is such a revolutionary technology. This is going to change medicine. And the worst thing that could have happened was what did happen, which is November 2020, you have these results that seem to show that this thing can really end COVID, that these vaccines can really end COVID, and people lost their minds over it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they did indeed. And then they were. Somebody showed me Jimmy Dore showed me about 30 different appearances by Peter Hotez on CNN, and it's so sad to watch the distortions and the thinking and the backpedaling and oh my God. At first I was like, okay, he changed his mind, fine, I get it, and then it's like, oh boy, oh boy. It gets weird and patronizing. So, what I'm noticing right now is that there's spiraling on both sides. Like things are getting weird in both directions. Have you noticed this? And that's why I was anxious to talk to you. You've always been the nice core. And I went through your X thread this morning. I'm like, I want some center data, and I didn't find it there. You were too busy writing about Pfizer and about Super Bowl ads. But it's kind of getting upsetting that people are going nutty in both directions.
I'm really glad to hear you say that, because it does disturb me that you have people. There were so few of us early on who stood up, against the lockdowns, against the school closures in 2020, all that stuff in 2020, and then who early on stood against the vaccines. And there are people who, to me, really didn't have loud voices, really didn't stand up against the consensus early on. And some of those people are now making just absurd claims about the vaccines. Okay. And I guess, I don't know if they genuinely believe it. What's that?
It doesn't help things. I think it doesn't help things. This whole notion that people are lying, it's like, I don't think people are lying. They're either motivated in sort of their change and their messaging, or they believe it. I don't think it's lying. They're like, I wanted to deceive people. No.
I think you're right. I hope you're right. But there's just no evidence that the vaccines have killed, 17 million people, 20 million people. I mean, just look at global death counts, and you can see this. By the way, I don't think the vaccine should be on the market. I've said that for forward of a year. Early on, I thought maybe they had some utility in people over 70, and maybe in people 50 to 70 who had serious chronic conditions. Certainly, since the vaccine started failing in the summer of 2021, I have been among the most aggressive people saying these things don't work. Since Omicron came around in early 2022, I've said they should be pulled. So I think my credentials. What's that?
Yeah, and we have treatment, and we have treatments.
We have
a mild illness, and we have treatments if it goes bad. And so here's where I'm confused now. First of all, are there excess deaths in the world? I don't think anybody's agreed on that yet. So number one, is that the case? And number two, this is a more disturbing thing, which is people are tweeting, 3,000 deaths this week from COVID. I'm like, what? How is that possible? You go walk into any hospital, there's no COVID patients. Walk in the ICU, no COVID patients. So it must be very elderly in the nursing homes or something. Well, why aren't they getting Paxlovid? Why aren't they getting treatment? What's going on here? Or is this just bullshit and they're dying of something else?
Well, so it's a very, very interesting question. So again, I think my credentials as somebody who's been on the forefront of mRNA skepticism are pretty good, Dr. Drew, and I don't think I can defend them. So here's what I would say. If you look at deaths in the US, for example, deaths are now about 10% higher than they were before COVID. Okay. Some of that is deaths of despair. Pretty clearly, especially in people under 50. There's more drug overdoses still. There's there's some alcohol deaths. There's the U.S. is going in a bad direction in a lot of ways, and that's some of the deaths. However, there's also some deaths of people 65 and older, and it's a little hard to know what's driving that. As you say, it looks like, if you believe the numbers, it's about 75 or 100,000 people are going to die of COVID this year, but nobody goes in the hospital. So what that suggests is, maybe if you have 2 weeks to live, you're exceptionally vulnerable to getting a case of COVID, and that's what goes on your death certificate. But so maybe at like the very end of life, it's shortening people's lives a little bit. And then there's so you subtract those, you say there's 100,000 deaths of despair extra and other deaths. Maybe there's 100,000 weird COVID deaths that are happening in really elderly people. And there's another 100,000 deaths. Okay. Are some of those deaths vaccine injuries? Possibly. I think the best evidence the vaccines caused excess deaths actually came from Europe in 2022. In late 2022, they vaccinated a lot of people and they didn't have much COVID, and they had a bump, not a huge bump, but a real bump in deaths. Okay. It didn't last, it lasted about 4 months and then it went away. And so to me, the temporal relationship there is pretty telling. But that was, we're not talking about millions of deaths. We're talking about tens of thousands of deaths. So is it possible that the vaccines have done some damage where they're killing I don't know, 50, 100,000 people a year in the US. I don't, it's to me, that is possible, but the data is just way too dirty to know. And when I say, oh, there's absolutely no way they killed 17 million people, it's absolutely impossible. People say, well, how many did they kill? And I say, look, I know the vaccines killed some people because, if you look at Qatar, for example, or South Korea, they've done autopsies where they directly link the vaccines to deaths in young people. Okay, so we know the vaccines killed some people. But if you're going to ask me, is it 1,000 or is it 1 million? I truly don't know, and I'm not going to guess. Okay.
That's where I'm at, the one thing that bothers me though, it wasn't 8. It's not 8. It's way more than the Vioxx story, and that was an international scandal. 8. So whatever. The other thing that's happening on the other side is I'm seeing all this data on saving children's lives and saving pregnant women's life, and every time I read those stories, the 2 things. I don't know if you've read those papers. 2 things. It's always data from 2020 forward, which, I believe it was very effective. I believe it worked at the beginning. I don't think it's doing anything right now. So why are we still talking about what happened 3 years ago, number one? And, oh, damn, what was the other part of that for me? Well, anyway, to address that, it'll come to me while you're addressing
I totally agree with you. Here's another, you raise a really good point, I agree. The vaccines in 2021, when they briefly actually worked, they did save some lives. The problem is the lives they saved were almost exclusively elderly people, right? Very elderly, very sick people. So the same people who die from COVID now. Okay. The people who seem to be the most injured by the vaccines, at least proportionally, are young people.
Yeah.
So once again, you have a problem where the good the vaccines may do is not on the people they may injure. And instead of being honest about that, and instead of saying to people under 50, you know what, you can wait. You don't necessarily have to ever get this vaccine. And if this vaccine had been rolled out properly, that is, if in early 2021, we had said, we're going to give this to people 65 and up, we're going to prioritize people 75 and up, everyone else, except if you're at incredibly high risk from COVID because you weigh, 500 pounds, you don't have to take this. We're going to get more safety data, and then we're going to tell you. I believe the vaccines probably never would have been given to people under 50. Okay, so there's
another trick. Yes, we have this problem, but I remember the other trick I wanted to point out to you, which is that I saw this in the pregnancy data, which is between the vaccine and the unvaccinated, there was higher hospitalization in the unvaccinated group. Okay. Nowhere did they document that the hospitalizations were due to COVID. Nowhere. So you have an increase in hospitalization. Who knows what is in there? Because you don't get hospitalized for COVID. I can't say that enough. It doesn't happen. And so I knew immediately that whatever they're being hospitalized for, it wasn't COVID. And I raised that with people like, oh, come on, you think they're going to put that data in? Find me where in the study it says they were hospitalized for COVID. It's not there. It doesn't happen.
You're correct. And so, but this is the problem. The problem of this age issue is the problem. This is the original sin of COVID. Okay. That in 2020, in March 2020, they, and in this case, there is a real they, it's the public health establishment, it's the WHO, it's Bill Gates. They wanted lockdowns. Okay. They were desperate for lockdowns. And they knew that if they were honest and said, look, if you're under 50 and you're not in terrible health, like this is not going to kill you, right? They wouldn't say that. And that set the stage for everything that followed, including the lies about the vaccines. And here's the problem. Like, people know it now, right? So nobody got the 2022 booster, and less than nobody got the booster last fall. So they've done but it really is, there's a they. They've done real damage to public health, not just in the United States, but I think worldwide.
Well, isn't it interesting that it's the same playbook? We keep hearing that this is the HIV playbook. And on that playbook, which I was executing in the 80s, you were not allowed to say that it was limited to risk populations. You had to say, for 10 years, we said, everybody is going to get this thing. And in Africa, we were watching it, move around in heterosexual. And so we had genuine fear it was going to happen. But there was an absolute party line. You do not mention the risk populations.
Wasn't it interesting that ultimately in the U.S., it was really gay men said, we're not being helped by this. We're the ones at risk here. You should target us to encourage healthier behaviors.
Well, they almost made the same mistake with monkeypox. It almost was all over again. Certain infections infect certain kinds of people with certain kinds of conditions. That's medicine. That's what medicine is. Things happen to old people that don't happen to young people. Things happen to pediatric populations that don't happen to adult populations. It's just medicine. And we're in such a weird state right now that we're not even allowed to discuss the biological human reality. I have to take a break, Alex. I'm way over this break time I have to do. But we're going to talk some more. Alex Berenson with me. Follow him on X. Alex Berenson. I'll be right back after this. Are you one of the millions of American women and men dealing with premature hair thinning and hair loss? Or maybe you're scared about inheriting that thinning look because it runs in your family? Start 2024 with a real solution that delivers results without the harsh side effects or unwanted chemicals and no need for prescription. Provia uses a safe natural ingredient, Procapil, to effectively target the three main causes of premature hair thinning and hair loss. By supporting healthy scalp circulation, the delivery of nourishing nutrients, and healthy hair follicle anchoring to your scalp, Provia guarantees more hair on your head than in the shower or on your comb. Right now, new customers save over 50% plus free shipping. Every introductory package includes a full 60-day supply of Provia serum for daily use, plus the Provia Super Concentrate for faster, more noticeable results. Don't wait. Order now to save an extra 10% and get free shipping at proviahair.com/Drew. That's PROVIAHAIR, proviahair.com/DREW. As a physician, I am deeply concerned about efforts to erode the doctor-patient relationship. And as medical freedom continues to come under assault, I'm on a mission to empower you to be able to take care of yourselves and your family the way you want to. I urge you to get this medical emergency kit from the Wellness Company. It contains essential prescription medication you should really always have on hand. Here's Dr. Peter McCullough, Chief Scientific Officer.
It's a very broad and diverse medical kit, can handle everything from a urinary tract infection, a fungal infection, a bronchitis. People can, via telemedicine, get their questions answered and get on the right track. But it's basically an at-home formulary. Yep. For the first time, people, instead of being held captive by an urgent care or by a doctor's office or an ER, they can actually do this themselves at home.
Save yourself the wait and the hassle and feel better faster. Go to drdrew.com/TWC for 10% off. That is drdrew.com/TWC for 10% off the medical emergency kit. Welcome back. Alex Berenson is my guest. Alex, go ahead and let's get him back in here so I can finish up our conversation. I interrupted you. You were trying to say something at the end there. Do you recall what?
I do not. You went to the hair ad, and I thought to myself, that's one problem I don't have.
That's good. We should have a barber that we send out. Oh, goodness. Okay, so it's just all so, I'm so conflicted in my feelings. I have the same kind of conflicted feelings about the pharmaceutical companies who have been wonderful sources of life-saving medication. That just is the case. By the way, do you answer my question? Is there any difference between U.S. and European pharma companies?
I don't think so. I mean, frankly, the U.S. is the biggest market for all these companies, right? And by far the most profitable. So they all play the same games. It's funny because Merck was considered the company, right? It was considered the most scientifically adept, the most serious. And then they went out with Vioxx and sold a drug that was pretty problematic. And they all have the same incentives, I think, unfortunately.
And so COVID is no longer creating hospitalization in spite of this continued sort of chanting that it does. I challenge people to go in hospitals and find COVID cases. And we have good treatments. We have Paxlovid, we have molnupiravir is a third one coming. And these treatments really, really, really work. And you can argue about early treatment, fine. Most people don't need any treatment. There's the fact. The vast majority of people don't need any treatment. And while Paxlovid has only been shown in the 65 plus population, I've seen it used in younger populations, it still works. And, are there risks with it? Rebound seems to be the only risk and a bad taste in the mouth. But the point is, no one's going to the hospital. There's no reason for it. And so this notion that we're saving people from severe COVID flies in the face of the effective treatments that the pharmaceutical companies have come up with.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Again, I think the world has moved past COVID. It's funny with my Substack, right? With Unreported Truths, I have this audience of people that's very interested in COVID. I'm still interested in COVID and in the vaccines in some ways, but people, as we are in our fourth year of this, it's not all I write about. I write about lots of other things that are of interest to me now. Drugs in general. So I mean illicit drugs and sort of the U.S. attitude towards those. The baby bust is something I've been writing about, and I think is very interesting. But there are. The world has sort of moved past COVID, aside from some hardliners who really want to say that vaccines, have killed millions and millions of people on very little evidence. And then this group of sort of long COVIDians who basically don't want to ever work again and thought that COVID was going to be their ticket to that and are very frustrated that they're not. I will say, I think there is one very, very big issue going forward, or two issues. One is that the mRNA platform is clearly problematic and cannot be moved into, for example, a flu vaccine or an RSV vaccine where it's being trialed in both of those illnesses without really good testing, long-term safety data. We failed to do that with COVID. We don't know how dangerous the mRNA platform is going forward. And how dangerous it may be upon long-term use. And again, if the issue, for example, is that this fat envelope that the mRNA is delivered in is problematic, then your total load of vaccine is going to make a difference. So in other words, if I've had 4 COVID shots and 5 RSV shots, that's 9 shots in terms of side effect, right? So that's something that I think the regulators really need to think about. They need to clamp down on this platform going forward. And it'll be interesting to see if they do that, because I think politically it's a little difficult for them to admit doing that. It means sort of admitting that they rushed the COVID jabs. And then the second issue,
of course they did. Of course they rushed it. Of course they rushed it. Of course they did.
But knowing you rushed it and admitting
and
you rushed it
are two different things. It was a good idea to rush it. I thought it was the right thing to do. Now do the proper research. That's all.
Now do the proper research. The second issue is pandemic preparedness. And my somewhat radical position on this is we should not have any pandemic preparedness. I think it's pretty clear that pandemic preparedness probably caused COVID. And if we continue to mess around in caves in China, and if we continue to mess around with gain of function in the quest to see how dangerous we can make things, there is only downside to this. I think a lot of virology is essentially out of control. And I think these folks are too sort of deep in their own heads and too financially incented to admit that. And from my point of view, pandemic preparedness should consist of having a bunch of gloves and masks, even though masks don't really work. They make people happy. And, maybe doing basic research into antivirals. But the idea that we should be playing around with these viruses, and by playing around, again, I also include the basic, let's go into a cave where nobody's going to go and see if we can find a bat that has some nasty virus. I think that's a mistake too. I think it should all stop. I think it should be outlawed by international treaty as a crime against humanity. And I think, the idea that the WHO and the Sam Bankman-Frieds of the world and Bill Gates are trying to encourage this and claiming, we need to get in front of the next pandemic. Dr. Drew, the truth is, COVID almost certainly came out of a lab. If you don't count COVID, we haven't had a serious respiratory virus pandemic since 1918. I think I like our odds a lot better with no preparedness than preparedness.
H1N was pretty bad. I had the pleasure of having that illness too, and that was a severely toxic illness, and it killed 300,000 people. And it was for real.
But it came and went, right? It came and went. I mean,
it came and went because because the Obama administration didn't tell anybody about it, and that was my point. As COVID was unrolling, I said, "Hey, everybody, we just had one 10 years ago. It was brutal. It killed a lot of people, and you don't even know it happened. And now we're going to go from not knowing it's going on to ruining our lives over this, and the outcomes are predictable." You mentioned the baby bust, and you talked about deaths of despair. Super 100%. I saw it coming. And that is the result of what we did with COVID. Hang on, Susan, you're trying to talk to me. I'm sorry, I can't. Yeah, okay. That's the result of.
If we allow these nitwits to have like a $5 or $10 billion a year kitty to prepare for the next pandemic, there's no question in my mind we're going to get one if we let that happen. It will leak from another lab. It just will.
Yeah, it's interesting. But you mentioned the baby bust. I want to talk about two of these sort of untoward consequences. One is the baby thing, and since you're writing about that, I'm going to have you talk about that a little bit. But the other thing is I feel like medical journals have been adulterated in some strange way. It's just odd. The way things are being constructed, the things that are being published, I don't know if you've done any thinking in that zone. I think about some of the studies that weren't being published, and some of them were great and excellent and finally got studied and should have created more in that direction, but didn't. And it's very, very odd.
Right. I mean, you're absolutely correct. This hit me really hard in 2020, in the fall of 2020, because there was a study that some Danish researchers had done about masks, a very good study, randomized controlled study where they'd sent people masks. This was before universal masking was happening, but COVID was happening. This was the summer of 2020 in Denmark. And it essentially had a null result. It showed that masks didn't seem to work against COVID infection. And they had a terrible time getting it published. Eventually, I think they got it published.
It wasn't. You forget. You weren't on this side of that. On the New England Journal had agreed, and it was waiting for it, and it telegraphed that they were going to publish it, and then all of a sudden they weren't. And then JAMA announced they're picking it up, and then they weren't.
Eventually,
it was Annals of Internal Medicine. Annals of Internal Medicine finally published it, and the same thing with the Bangladesh study. Same thing.
Yep, they couldn't get it in the Lancet. They couldn't get it in NEJM. Eventually, the Annals of Internal Medicine, to its credit, published it, but it took them 4 months. It was bad. And there's actually another mask study that came out in 2022 that also showed a failure that I hadn't even heard of because it was suppressed is the wrong word. It did get published, but it got no attention. And you're right. I mean, look, I've talked to physicians about this. The peer review process, when you have a politicized profession, peer review is politicized. And so even if the study is very good and can't really be challenged in a scientific reasons, even if the epidemiology is good and no one can question, the mouse models that they used or whatever, it will get slow walked or possibly not published at all if the conclusion is not what people want to hear.
Yeah. And in your book, in Pandemia, does this all get reviewed if people want to dig into the book?
I mean, the book, so it's funny, the book came out in December 2021. And so, in some ways, nothing much has changed since then. It's really sad. I would say the vaccines look worse now than they did then. But, and I'm back on Twitter. I was off Twitter at that time. I'd been banned, and then I sued Twitter and forced it to let me back on. That was before Elon took over, which, by the way, was something else the media absolutely refused to cover, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, but disappointingly. But so it's in Pandemia. It's funny. This is the longest I've gone without writing a book-length work in almost 20 years as a writer. When I worked at the New York Times, I wrote fiction. That sounds weird, but I wrote some novels in the second half of my career, and then I wrote more novels, and then I wrote a book about cannabis that we've talked about, and then I wrote Pandemia. And since 2021, I've only been writing unreported truths. It's funny. I work harder for myself now than I ever did for the New York Times. I write 4 times a week, basically every week, because I have this pretty large audience, and I feel they're paying me and they want me to write, but it doesn't give me the energy or the space to write a book. And I do think there's a need for another book about the pandemic and about the total failure, long-term failure of the mRNA platform that we seem to be seeing. And it's like I need a second brain, or I need to tell the people on Substack on Unreported Truths, hey, give me 6 months, let me work on a book, because it's an important book.
Someone needs to put together all the excesses of the government and the silencing, all the stuff that hopefully comes out in Biden versus Missouri. So, because that was really the sort of egregious aspect of the whole pandemic, when people were harmed by our government and silence and speech was attacked. It's a dark chapter that needs to be looked at.
You don't want to, because they were more than complicit. They were active in it.
But I mean, we need to get it out there, though, so people can really look at what happened. Because I don't think that people everything's so siloed. I don't think they really know how bad it got, and what extraordinary people were harmed and lost jobs, and really, really high level professionals of extraordinary credentials with spotless records. These were their targets. And that needs to be brought out. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And the fact that they're mostly right. Have you had to adjust course on anything? What have you gotten wrong? Because I think of your cannabis thing, it's like, hey, you pretty much got all that all right. Pandemic, pretty much got all that all right. So where do you get things wrong?
So what I got wrong, the most notable thing I got wrong was and I don't count, by the way, saying, 100,000 people might die in March 2020. I mean, nobody said 1 million people, but beyond the fact that the counting, is fakakta, but nobody was putting out numbers. Nobody thought we would have a single count for 3 years, right? That's not how we count the flu or anything else, right? We start the clock again each year. So not counting that, one thing I got wrong was I had been reading about sort of cross immunity in summer 2020. And I did think it was possible that, that maybe 80% of the population wouldn't get infected with COVID. That maybe because you saw these sort of bursts whether it was in New York or whether it was in Arizona, where you had very big spikes and then they passed very quickly, sort of on their own. But that turned out to be wrong. Everyone wound up getting infected with COVID. So I was wrong about that. That's the number one thing I got wrong. I'm trying to think of something I got wrong with the vaccines.
You were focused on a lot of Israeli data. Did that remember that you were reporting a lot of Israeli data before anyone over here heard it, and some of that got a little sideways, didn't it?
No, what I would say was, so what happened was, and this is something that also doesn't get talked about. In retrospect, although also at the time, when you give people the first shot, there's this clear suppression of immunity. So the very worst spike of COVID in the US, in the UK, in Israel too, actually, came in the winter of 2021, in January 2021, when people were getting their first COVID shot. And in part, actually, that's because of something we were talking about off air, where people would go, the opening of a nursing home to give people shots meant that a protected population was suddenly made vulnerable, right? And so some of those people got COVID for environmental reasons, but there was also a spike that in those first couple of weeks, which the vaccine proponents never admitted. And they also didn't admit that when you're looking at a vaccine a quote unquote vaccine that only works for 6 months, if it has negative effectiveness the first 2 weeks, that's a real negative, and you have to count that. But so there was a spike, and then you had what I called in pandemia and what I've called ever since the happy vaccine valley. So for 1 to 6 months after that first shot, and 0 to 6 months after the second shot, you actually have vaccine effectiveness, right? And that was the spring and summer of 2021. That's when the vaccines they saved some lives. That's when they thought, people actually thought we can make COVID go away. And then the vaccine stopped working. Okay. They create this crazy, unnaturally high level of antibodies. Those antibodies go away. The vaccines stop working. And so there was a period in the spring of 2021 when I thought, you know what, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe vaccines actually work. This is not going to look very good for me if they work. And what I had to tell myself, which turned out to be correct, was we don't have the data. We didn't do studies for long enough. We don't know. And this seems very strange to me that you're going to be able to keep this incredibly high level of antibodies for long enough to matter. And that turned out actually to be right. But when people, just like you said a few minutes ago, when people run these studies claiming that a lot of lives were saved, they always talk about 2021. That's the only period. That's the only period when you can say I was wrong. Because if you look at the totality of the last 3 years, I was not wrong.
And they censored all the people that knew what the hell was going on. So we couldn't get any answers because they censored every doctor and you and anybody who had common sense. Sorry,
Susan's
I had
angry.
to pile on.
Susan is still angry. So
it started vaccinating babies. Like what?
yeah, well, it's still vaccinating babies, and it's very hard to understand why based on current data, not old data. I get it. There were children that died. I get it. There was some benefit. It's a pediatric decision. By the way,
Yeah, for old people.
The other thing I realized, Alex, is that most of these public health officials are pediatricians, and they're trying to make decisions about adult medicine. And that I can't make decisions about kids. I don't, especially young kids. I don't know how to do that. They have a different risk tolerance. They're a very different way of looking at things.
Yeah, and we want to talk about censorship.
I go
with
further
Alex.
than that. Okay, and I know we're short of time. I would say that you become a public health doctor because you want. I think so. I think a lot of them have a hero complex. Okay, I'm going to save society. I'm going to show these people, the way out. They're going to listen to me. And there's nothing more dangerous than somebody who thinks they're doing something that you don't want them to do to you for your own good. And
social evil is always done in the name of good. I'll remind everyone that Robespierre's committee was called the Committee for Public Safety. So there you go.
That's right.
Susan, what do you want to ask about there?
What's going on with Alex's lawsuit and censorship? Did you guys talk about that?
A little bit.
We did not. But so I've sued. I sued Twitter, and that was in 2022. People said, "Oh, this is a dumb lawsuit. He can't possibly get past the motion to dismiss. It's going to get thrown out." Guess what? It survived the motion to dismiss. I settled with Twitter. I got put back on Twitter. I got documents from Twitter showing that Scott Gottlieb, who was formerly the head of the FDA and was a Pfizer board member, was campaigning for my removal. And then Andy Slavitt, who was a senior White House official, the senior advisor to the COVID response, when he was at the White House and afterwards, was campaigning for my removal from Twitter. And ultimately, they forced Twitter to remove me. I've now sued. I've sued Slavitt. I've sued Gottlieb. I've sued Albert Bourla, who's the chairman of Pfizer, and I've sued the Biden administration over that unconstitutional. It's a violation of my First Amendment rights. It's a public-private conspiracy called the 1985-3 conspiracy, and I've sued the private defendants in that case for tortious interference. In other words, for violating my contract with Twitter. The case is in federal court in New York City, and it's sort of on hold right now. We've filed some motions. The defendants have filed some motions. The judge will do what the judge will do. I hope, obviously, she'll rule in our favor. The judge appears to be waiting for Missouri v. Biden and a second important Supreme Court case called NRA v. Volo, which is about how it's another case about how much, in this case, New York State officials can pressure private companies to try to get an outcome they want. So in the NRA v. Volo case, the state of New York tried essentially to get insurance companies to drop the NRA as a defendant because it didn't like the NRA. And the Second Circuit, which includes New York State, which the federal circuit that includes New York State, said that's okay. That case has now been appealed to the Supreme Court. I think it should be overturned. Believe it or not, the ACLU actually thinks it should be overturned because, if the state of New York can do that to the NRA, maybe the state of Texas will do that to Planned Parenthood.
Right.
So when those two cases are decided, when Missouri v. Biden, which is obviously the big free speech case, is decided, and NRA v. Volo, which is more about, again, state power and trying to disempower political views you don't like. When those two cases are decided, I expect we'll get a decision in Berenson v. Biden. It could come before, but that's sort of what my lawyer and I, are expecting at this point.
Please come back when that comes through. I can't wait to hear how that.
I'm so proud of you.
And then Caleb, you had flashed a question up there. I'm not sure I caught it.
Yeah, I'm just curious about Alex, because a lot of people go on this journey and they kind of start, or at least recently have started with looking, suspiciously at mRNA, and then they've gone to the next step, which is to look suspiciously at all vaccines and all vaccine science. Have you crossed over that bridge? Are you anywhere on that bridge right now? I
have not, and a lot of my readers want me to. And my feeling about it is life is too short. And it's one thing people always say, or people on the left say, he's an anti-vaxxer. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. My kids have all been vaccinated, including some of them have been vaccinated since, I started raising questions about the mRNAs. I'm an mRNA skeptic. I'm a pharmaceutical industry skeptic. I frankly think we should probably end vaccine immunity, certainly for newer vaccines, because, it's no longer, these are totally different products than they were in 1986 when the vaccine immunity was given. But I am not an anti-vaxxer. And honestly, there are so many people fighting on that issue, and positions are so entrenched. I like to investigate stuff where I think I can actually find new facts and make a difference. And I don't see how I could possibly do that in this case. So I've avoided it. And as I say,
the big complaint is checks and balances. That's the big complaint, that there's no checks with them. That's to me, that was RFK's position too. It's your position. Makes sense to me. And I'm not anti-vax either, and I will never be, because I've helped people with vaccines. I've seen it. I know how this works. But I would like some sanity in the system, some balances. The immunity where it comes in always. And we have homelessness because of qualified immunity when our public officials, because they can let people die on our streets, and doesn't mean none of them. And 8 are dying every day in LA County. No county officials are being held accountable because they can't be. So that's a problem. So
yes, I mean, we have a. Sorry, go on.
Finish your thought. I'm sorry, we have this little delay here that makes it look like we're interrupting each other. But
we have a very robust drug discovery system in this country, despite the fact that the companies don't have liability protection for drugs. They don't need liability protection, or they certainly don't need complete liability protection for vaccines, especially these vaccines that work in totally different ways and that are far, far from 100% effective. These should be regulated as drug products, in my opinion.
What I was always led to believe, and I guess this is wrong, was, these vaccines are they can't get any money. The vaccines are not a way to make money, so they have to be protected, or they'd never do the research in the vaccine. That's turning out to not be true.
In 1986, that was true. That's not true of the HPV. I mean, Gardasil was a multi-billion-dollar product. The the COVID vaccines, Pfizer made tens of billions of dollars on. No, when it was we're going to have eggs, and the flu vaccine, and we're going to sell it for $3. Then it was actually a problem. But it's just a totally different landscape around new vaccines.
Alex, I'm going to let you go. You've been very kind with your time and your thoughts, and always great to see you again and come back here. Best of luck with this suit. I can't wait to see. Go get the book. Support Alex by getting the book. And it's Pandemia and Pandemia.
Unreported Truths.
And the Substack.
I'll talk to you soon, Dr. Drew. Thank you.
All right, take care of yourself. You betcha. We have a
Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day, indeed. We have a second guest.
He was one of our first guests on that was censored.
Oh, is that
when
right?
his book was taken off of Amazon right at the very beginning of the pandemic, and we got a hold of him, and we were doing Dose of Dr. Drew, and I remember having him, and he's like, I got to do it before my kids come home. And he was like,
I remember there being like a white wall behind him.
yeah.
Right?
And then you'd hear the kids, and he's like, oh, I got to go now.
That's really funny. So yeah, and he's got a bunch of other.
But I think he got censored from Twitter after that. And then he, for being rational and asking questions, it's just ridiculous. Anyways, sorry.
Yeah. Did we address everything you wanted to address, Susan? Was there?
Yeah, I wanted to hear about his suit.
Okay. Was that what you were pointing out on the phone or
Yep.
something? Okay. You got to come right
I know, honey. I know. I texted you, but you just didn't get the memo.
Got it. So we have another guest, and this is going to be a complete change of topic. We're just doing this as a little add-on here for those of us in California in particular. Yeah, my ballot is right here. I brought I do my mail-in ballot. I know there's all kinds of consternation about that, but Vice President of Communications for the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. As I remember, Howard Jarvis was Prop 13, if I remember right. Susan Shelley, also a member of the editorial board for the Southern California News Group. You can find her on X at Susan_Shelley, and Shelley is SHELLEY. And SusanShelley.com is where you can find more. Please welcome Susan. Hey, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
And I want you to know you're going to have to do some convincing of me, which is an opportunity for you, because I read Prop 1. We're talking about homelessness for those of you not in California. And I read Prop 1. I thought, well, it's not perfect, but it's something. And it's going in the right direction, at least in terms of treating these conditions that are creating homelessness. It's the first time you were able to put homelessness and mental health on the same printed anything. You're just not allowed to put those two things together. And that's gotten people to now see through all that and realize how insane that is. But why is Prop 1 not a good idea?
Well, for several reasons. First, it's $6.38 billion of borrowed money, which is $12 billion when the taxpayers finish paying it back in 30 years. And what does it buy? It buys 6,800 treatment beds and about 4,300 housing units. So if you just do the math, that's an awful lot of money for not as much benefit as you would expect for the kind of spending commitment that is.
Let me ask. I want to ask, they keep saying beds, and I couldn't find anything in fact, this is what concerned me, in the documents that voters get that describe what these beds are going to provide. Are they psychiatric beds? Are they halfway houses? Is this just more places for poor social workers to do things they're not trained to do? Who's gonna pay for the doctors and nurses and policies and procedures and things we require in California to run a hospital? Is any of that in there?
Well, you have put your finger right on it. First of all, they're not hospitals. They're in the category of housing, which means they're under housing first, which means no one can be required to be in treatment to receive the housing or the bed or anything. It's the community care model. It's not hospitals. The governor could ask for an IMD waiver, an IMD exclusion waiver, which I know you're familiar with. Mm-hmm. That's the part of Medicaid that says you can't be reimbursed. No federal matching funds for mental health care in a facility with more than 16 beds. So we could get a waiver from that, and we could spend $6 billion building hospital facilities, and they won't do that. So they're going to build community facilities unspecified. They are borrowing the money. It's a blank check. The state will decide later what they're going to build. And as far as operating this, now here's the part that I think will persuade you. It is robbing money from the county mental health services funding. It's taking that money from the millionaire's tax that passed in 2004, which was supposed to fund county mental health services, additional and new and innovative services, not just replace the existing budget. I didn't say it was going well. But what they're doing is they're taking the funding from it. So they take it in 4 different ways. The first way is that under the Mental Health Services Act, the state would get 5% and the counties would get 95%. The state doubles its take under Prop 1 to 10%. And of the remaining funds that the counties have, they're required to spend 30% on housing programs, which is, we can talk about what those are in a second. But when you spend money on housing, you lose the federal matching funds. So that's the third way that they're losing money, is they lose the federal matching funds. And the fourth way is that whatever places, that's what the legislative analyst called them, places, unspecified places for treatment, the state builds with the borrowed money, the counties are responsible for funding the operations. So the first thing that's going to happen if this passes in March is in November, the counties are going to start putting tax increases on the ballot and saying, we don't have enough money for suicide prevention programs,
right?
Because we have to spend it on all of this. So that's really what's wrong with it.
It would not be that much money to build hospitals and run them. It really wouldn't. And I am just keep over and over telling these officials they are running hospitals without doctors and nurses. Social workers are not trained to do this work. They can't even assess, because they're not medical, whether there are medical needs or psychiatric needs to a certain extent. They are wonderful at what they do, but it is literally like asking a physical therapist to do orthopedic surgery. It's not, they're wonderful, and it is not what they are trained to do. And this is an insanity. This is an insanity. And I would love to hold these officials responsible for the deaths that are going on 8 a day in LA County in particular. This to me is just unconscionable. If that were actually a hospital, just because it doesn't have walls doesn't mean it's not a place where people get medical care. There's a hospital without walls with no doctors and nurses. If there were such a place with walls, who would be getting sued? What kind of criminal action would be taken for the negligence? It's just, you think about it, it's mind-boggling. And yet we can't get when I talk to a group of county officials, national group of county officials, I called them all essentially murderers, negligent manslaughter, because they're sending in people that are not trained to do the work. They're like, oh, what? I didn't know. It's just how it was when I got the job. Yeah, okay, well, change it. Bring the right people in to do the job. And we need armies of people, and we could do it, but it's going to take a lot of work. And it's not even that expensive. That's the thing that gets me. And you could build go ahead.
If we borrow $6.38 billion to not build hospitals, then what are we going to do to build hospitals? They don't want to build hospitals, but that's what's needed.
How does it even work within the setting of the extreme?
So vote no.
The extreme shortfall, the extreme budgetary shortfall this year already. I mean, I
was excited to see it, and then I was like, "Oh, look, Drew, they're doing something about the homeless finally." And then I heard you on KBC with John Phillips, and I heard what you said, and I went, "Oh, crap, here we go again." I don't know, like when they used to have a thing where you could roll over your property taxes if you're over a certain age and sell your house, and in California. And then they had this proposition, and it looked really good for seniors, but it took away the good part. And I was like, you got to read to the very bottom and read the fine print.
Even the fine print doesn't give you have to think of the things that are necessary.
In this particular case, it's just too much but I agree, 6,800 beds is not worth $8 billion.
Well, if it's $3 billion to run them for 10 years or something, I mean, then we could get people through. I mean,
they were kind of pointing it at the veterans in the thing. It was like, it's going to help the veterans.
Are the veterans going to get most of this or no? Yeah.
No.
Tell me about that.
Here's how this is divided. $4.4 billion goes to build the unspecified places for treatment, and $2 billion goes for housing into the same program that is currently buying hotels and converting them with the optional services down the hall that no one's required to use. And what they've done, they're concerned that they're having trouble getting neighborhoods to approve having these built in their area, so they took away the ability for communities to approve it. So there's ministerial streamlined approval for converting hotels to housing in which the residents can still be using hard drugs because of Housing First, which is the state principle that's in law from, I think it's SB 1380, if I remember right, from 2016, written by Holly Mitchell, now on the Board of Supervisors, running for re-election.
I can't wait till we get the fatality rates within walls. It's going to be no different than outside. It may be worse inside because they're really free to do your thing. But
very much.
Do you have that data yet? But what about the veterans? You didn't say what's going to the veterans. Nothing.
$2 billion. $2 billion of the bond goes to housing. $1 billion of that is reserved for veterans, but it is going to build a total of 2,300 housing units. And as of January 2022, there were 10,400 homeless veterans. That's the previous point in time count. So this is just window dressing, really. If they wanted to help veterans, they would spend the whole $6 billion helping veterans, but they're not. They're just putting enough of it in there so they can say veterans in the commercial and veterans on the ballot. And you won't be surprised to hear that veterans poll very well when they use that language.
Right, of course. And is this going to be built over at the VA in Westwood or something? Do they have a spot yet where they don't have to worry about it's already federal lands?
I don't think they've gone that far. They said 4,350 units, I believe, and about 2,300 for reserved for veterans. But that's a very small amount.
So it's very hard. It's very hard not to. It's very hard not to vote for units for veterans. It's hard not to, even if it's not with treatment. Even if it's really hard.
It's true.
Given how much is just out of control on our streets, I imagine the average person is going to go, well, we got to do something.
Well, what if the success rate is 50%? You know what I mean?
Success in what sense?
4,300 homes for people, and only 50% of people actually stay in them, or it works out for them, or you know what I mean? How do you know what the success rate is going to be? The number gets smaller and smaller. We have 100,000 homeless people in the street in California, in LA. That's just not that much.
We can look at the numbers from Project Room Key and the numbers from Project Home Key, and we don't have a report showing success on these policies. And yet this is doubling down on the same policies, not changing them, but funding the same program that is converting this housing. And by the way, it all has to be built in accordance with prevailing wage rules, which means it will be as expensive as humanly possible to build each of these units. And this we're seeing in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Right. This we're seeing in Los Angeles under the $1.2 billion bond that the voters of LA approved for homeless housing. It was supposed to be 10,000 units. I think now they think it'll be 7,500 on a good day, but some of them are costing $800,000 each to build. So
right. I'm aware of that.
Yeah, that's just not, it's not the way to solve this problem.
Well, Susan, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us, and people will have to make their own decisions. It is up to the voters. And where can people find more?
They can find more at the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association website at hjta.org. You can see what HJTA thinks of this measure. It's recommending a no vote on Proposition 1. And you can find me at the Los Angeles Daily News, dailynews.com, and on Twitter at Susan_Shelley, SHELLEY.
Thanks, Susan. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Dr. Drew.
And so, you betcha. Tomorrow, Caleb, I think we have more great guests coming our way. We have Zuby, Rob Henderson, his new book, Troubled, Willie Soon, Tess Laurie, Brett Weinstein, Dave Rubin, Kevin Bass with Dr. Victor, which can be a really interesting conversation. Kevin has been now kicked out of medical school. I hope he sues, because I got a lot of thoughts about how egregious he was treated, but we'll find out the whole story here. So, and we appreciate you all being here. Brett Weinstein is a big deal, guys. We'll get the chance to talk to him, and it'll be very interesting. I'm a biologist by training, so I would love to pick somebody's brain like that. Follow us at Ask Dr. Drew on Twitter. Updates for shows and guests are there. Do follow us on the Rumble channel. Subscribe. Tell a friend. Let me look quickly at what you guys are saying on the restream. A lot of you are not from California, so you're not coming in on this. Happy Valentine, as Molten Salt says, Happy Valentine's Day. Susan, it's for you.
I know they love me over there.
And Caleb's in there screaming Ree. What's that, Susan? On your mic. On your mic, I don't hear you.
YouTube's trying to figure out who I am and asking if I'm jabbed.
YouTube is? Yeah. What is that?
I was jabbed, by the way. Yeah. I was jabbed 3 times because the first time I got an early vaccine right at the beginning.
We were going to Europe.
Yeah, and we were going to go to Europe. And Drew
you hadn't had COVID yet either.
Drew was supposed to get it. I hadn't gotten COVID. So I got the vaccines at the beginning when all the 80-year-olds were getting it. And I didn't tell anybody because I wasn't supposed to. But anyways, I also got a booster because we had to fly to New York and I wanted to be able to go out to dinner. That's we have a place in New York. So we like to go back and forth. And then we also, we're going to Laguna and I like to go to dinner. And you had to show your vaccine card.
Except Dana Point.
Then we
Dana
had to fly.
Point was a bastion of freedom.
Then we went to Greece.
Thank you, Dana Point.
We went to
California.
Greece and had more COVID tests. I mean, in a week, we were getting a swab every 5
every
minutes.
other day, yeah.
On a cruise.
Yeah.
Like they go, okay, it's 2 o'clock. Everybody in your room.
First
We're going to.
ship post-COVID out of Athens Harbor.
Yeah. So we went, we had a great time. Nobody had COVID on the entire ship. We all made it back alive. And then.
Hey, when I did Special Forces, that's like a year later.
Right.
I had to be quarantined for a week in a hotel.
Right. And whenever you did
we all
television.
tested every day with TV.
You tried to do Teen Mom and we couldn't do the Skankfest because you had to do Teen Mom the next week. Everybody got it at the Skankfest too. But anyways, I was like, no, sorry, Skanks. Can't have Dr. Drew. He has Teen Mom coming up. But if you work in Hollywood or you want to go out to dinner like old people do.
Or travel to Europe.
Old
Europe
people.
was brutal about this. Remember?
And I honestly, it was just really hard to watch how stupid it was, but we still, showed our vaccine card every time. And, it was just so irritating, but we did it. And fortunately I didn't have any side effects. Drew did. And
Douglas did. He looked terrible.
Douglas did. Yeah. A couple family members. I
wouldn't let him get boosted because he got so sick from the vaccine.
But, I may have lost a tooth. I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah, right. That's
I had a weird infection in my tooth,
right.
but I had to yank it out.
Hard to say.
I know, isn't that sexy, everybody over on Rumble?
It was awesome.
But anyways, I did get the vaccine. If I didn't have to, I'm not saying I would.
There we go.
Because I'm a pretty hardy soul, and I think that if I'd caught COVID, I probably wouldn't have gotten as sick as I have. I've had COVID 5 times, so the vaccines didn't do diddly.
Right. Of course.
Well,
it kept you out of the hospital.
Yeah,
So You wouldn't have been in the hospital, trust me.
I needed my papers. My papers had to be
have papers.
updated, and so I could roam around the world.
So Zuby has been a source of solace and sanity through this, and he and I've exchanged little DMs here and there, but I've never really spoken to him. Corolla has talked to him, and I look forward to talking to him tomorrow. So join us tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Zuby's our guest. We'll see you here.
Zip.
Ask Dr. Drew is produced by Caleb Nation and Susan Pinsky. As a reminder, the discussions here are not a substitute for medical care, diagnosis, or treatment. This show is intended for educational and informational purposes only. I am a licensed physician, but I am not a replacement for your personal doctor, and I am not practicing medicine here. Always remember that our understanding of medicine and science is constantly evolving. Though my opinion is based on the information that is available to me today, some of the contents of this show could be outdated in the future. Be sure to check with trusted resources in case any of the information has been updated since this was published. If you or someone you know is in immediate danger, don't call me, call 911. If you're feeling hopeless or suicidal, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 800-273-8255. You can find more of my recommended organizations and helpful resources at drdrew.com/help.